Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into what is, without a doubt, one of the most historically weighty and deeply emotional periods in Islamic history, the final days of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because of the sheer magnitude of this event, we're going to walk through this material with the careful reverence it really demands. We're looking at how a journey that literally reshaped the entire Arabian Peninsula and ultimately the whole world reached its earthly conclusion. Let's get right into it.
There's a really stark truth we all have to confront. Every single human life, no matter how extraordinary, no matter how blessed or central to world history, it ends. And this was absolutely true even for the final prophet of Allah. The man who went from being known as Al-Amin, the completely trustworthy one in Mecca, to the towering leader who stood before over 100,000 people during his farewell pilgrimage, he was ultimately mortal. And as we're going to see, facing the reality of his mortality would end up being the absolute ultimate test for his followers.
It's actually wild how rapidly everything shifted. Back in late Safar of the 11th year after the Hijrah, what started out as just a simple headache and a fever escalated so quickly. The historical sources describe his fever as being so intensely hot that simply touching him felt like touching a burning object. Think about that for a second. Yet, despite this massive physical drain, his persistence was just absolute. He kept moving between his wives' homes until he was finally granted permission to settle and stay in Aisha's care. And even then, when his weakness became so severe that his feet were literally dragging on the ground while being supported by Ali and Al-Fadl just to get to the mosque, he pushed himself. He pushed himself to fulfill his duties for as long as his body physically allowed.
Now, what's truly remarkable here is where his mind was during those final, agonizing days. He wasn't focused on himself at all. Instead, he issued these incredibly clear, unwavering directives to his ummah, his community. Over and over, he kept repeating, the prayer, and fear Allah regarding those under your authority. He strictly warned them against turning graves into places of worship, making absolutely sure the pure monotheism he spent his life building wouldn't be compromised. He emphasized caring for the weak, and crucially, he left absolutely zero personal wealth behind. None. Just his guidance. He left the Quran and his Sunnah to keep his community unified.
But right in the middle of all those grand instructions for a rapidly growing nation, we find this profoundly tender, deeply human detail. In his final hours, resting heavily in Aisha's lap, he was just too weak to even use a siwak, a traditional tooth-cleaning stick. So Aisha actually gently chewed it first. She chewed it to soften it up for him before he used it. It's just this incredibly intimate, quiet moment of care that's been beautifully preserved across 14 whole centuries. It really grounds the story, showing us the very real physical reality of his final moments.
And those final moments culminated in these exact words, Bala ar-Rafiq al-Ala, which translates to, rather, the highest companion. The sources actually tell us that the Prophet ﷺ was presented with a conscious, ultimate choice. He could choose to remain in this temporary world, or he could choose to proceed to the highest companionship of Allah, the angels, and the righteous in paradise. And, entirely consistent with how he lived his entire life, always choosing the eternal over the temporary, he made his choice known. Shortly after speaking those final words, his breathing ceased.
June 8th, 632 CE, or the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, this is the definitive historical marker, the exact date the world changed forever. When the news spread through Medina, the psychological and emotional shock was just absolute. Think about it. For 23 years, this community's entire existence was completely organized around his physical presence. The grief was so entirely overwhelming that Bilal, the man whose iconic voice had called the azan for years, found himself physically unable to ever call the prayer in Medina again. The entire city was just plunged into this sudden, incredibly dark uncertainty.
Which immediately brings us to a massive leadership crisis. And it's really defined by two completely opposite reactions. On one side, you have Umar. Now, Umar is a man of immense strength, right? But he was viscerally unable to accept reality. He stood before the crowds, completely emotionally shattered, actually threatening violence to anyone who dared say the Prophet was dead. He claimed he was just going to return, just like the Prophet Musa had returned to his people. It was a chaotic, emotional earthquake. But then, on the other side, you have Abu Bakr. He arrived, physically went in to kiss the Prophet's forehead to confirm the absolute truth with his own eyes. And then, he stepped out to address that panicked crowd with this unbelievable stabilizing composure.
Abu Bakr silenced the crowd and recited a specific verse from Surah Al-Imran. And this moment right here, it brilliantly demonstrates exactly why Abu Bakr was so vital. He didn't invent some brand new theology to calm the panic. No, he firmly redirected the community back to the divine revelation they already knew. He reminded them, whoever worshipped Muhammad, Muhammad has died. But whoever worships Allah, Allah is living and never dies. Umar actually later said that hearing this verse made his legs literally give way beneath him. It was like the truth finally, heavily set in.
So, with the reality finally accepted, the incredibly sacred duty of preparing his body began. His closest family members washed him reverently. But uniquely, they actually left his garments on, due to his elevated status. Yet, he was shrouded in the exact same simple white cloths used for the poorest believer, which is such a profound reflection of the absolute simplicity of his life. And because no single person could possibly act as an intermediary to lead the funeral prayer for the Prophet himself, companions just entered in groups to pray individually. Finally, following the principle that prophets are buried exactly where they die, he was laid to rest right there, directly beneath Aisha's room, right adjacent to his mosque.
But, even as he was being buried, this massive, urgent question just hung over Medina. Who is going to lead the Ummah now? The political vacuum was immediate, and honestly, it was dangerous. There were genuine, immediate risks of tribal fragmentation, of new converts completely abandoning the faith. The community had to address the practical necessity of continuity right then and there. And that's what led to the consultation and the eventual selection of Abu Bakr as the first caliph, ultimately ensuring the young Islamic state wouldn't just collapse in its own grief.
All right, let's look at the living legacy, 10 enduring lessons. Because as you'll see, these events of 632 CE, they aren't just dry history. They form a literal blueprint. They connect directly to how you and I manage faith, loss, and leadership in our own modern lives today.
So looking at the first 5 lessons, the crucial point here is just incredibly validating for us. Preparing for our own mortality, that's an act of wisdom, not pessimism. And look closely at lessons 2 and 3. The immense silence and grief of Bilal and that fierce raging denial from Umar, they show us that deep sorrow, or even struggling to accept a loss, are absolutely not failures of faith. They are profoundly, deeply human. It also reminds us that when crisis hits, we need grounded leaders like Abu Bakr who can calmly remind us that our ultimate faith has to rest in the eternal divine, never in any mortal human being.
Now, let's carry that energy into the final 5 lessons, where we see the actual blueprint for moving forward. Simplicity and communal duty, right? They anchor us. But lessons 8, 9, and 10, these are literally the engine of the community's survival. They prove that despite paralyzing, heartbreaking grief, practical life absolutely must continue. The Prophet ﷺ left behind the Quran and the Sunnah, effectively shifting his followers' reliance from his physical presence to his eternal guidance. And this just proves that a life truly well-lived leaves enough structure behind so that when the messenger departs, the message itself survives and thrives.
And that brings us to our final, most important thought. The message endures. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passed from this physical earth 14 centuries ago. Yet the guidance he left behind is literally shaping the daily lives of over 1 billion people today. The physical journey ended, sure, but the legacy absolutely didn't. So here's a question I want to leave you with as we wrap up this explainer. If this message was specifically designed to outlive the messenger, how are you ensuring that enduring legacy remains alive and active in your own life today? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep learning.